There we go. The record button is working. Marvelous. So delighted to welcome you here today, Helen, to look at, like we said, looking back at going forward. So over to you.
Lovely. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for giving up your time to join this session. Hopefully, we're, as Andrew said, going to be able to participate quite a lot in the chat and reflect on some of the key questions and to hear about what's going on in your own organizations or in the circles that you're working in as well. As Andrew kindly introduced, I'm Chief Learning Officer at Thrive, and my role is very much focused on what good learning looks like for us as a product and across the industry as well. So you'll often hear me having conversations with various people across our space, and it's a large part of my role is responding to what's going on in the industry. So at the beginning of the year, I had quite an in-depth conversation with Mark Ward, one of our co-founders, to think about what were going to be the trends for 2023. And we were quite conscious of not jumping on the bandwagon of using buzzwords, but actually responding to problems that we were seeing in the industry. Now, this session, as we're coming up to 9 months through the year, is a chance for us to look back and think about whether we were right in what we suggested, whether the problems that exist within organizations are still the same problems, or whether anything new has cropped up. And that's really where your participation will be coming in. So I've got some assumptions that we've made based on the work that we do with our customers. But ultimately, I'd like your input here to figure out whether we're still looking at the right things and whether our customers are also highlighting things that are going on in your businesses and your organizations as well. So just to take it back to 2022 very briefly, which feels like a lifetime ago now, but is really only that 9 months ago, we started off focusing on this chart, which I appreciate you might not be able to read in depth, so we can share the link to it afterwards. But this is a chart that Lavinia may head into from Offbeat. And again, if you've not heard of Offbeat, go and check them out. They're a learning community that brings learning professionals together to create a community, coaching and mentoring opportunities, and access to content. But what they did here was bring a whole host of industry reports, I think about 50 different L&D and HR reports together to look at some of those trends and topics that were happening within L&D and HR more broadly. This was quite interesting, and I think a great place for us to start at the beginning of the year, thinking about what were hot topics and what potentially were going to be the focus areas as we head into 2023, as we headed into 2023, and then beyond now into 2024 as well, because artificial intelligence was placed as the current kind of norm that people were experiencing, rather than in an innovation zone, which I thought was quite an interesting reflection at the time, and one maybe we could argue about whether it should have been placed in that section at all. But ultimately, what was really interesting from this collation of research was the need for peer learning, for self-paced learning, for learning on the job or learning in the flow of work, inclusive learning, and development of power skills. These were all called out as really kind of core focus areas for L&D. And that is certainly something that we're still seeing people talk about, and rightly so, particularly from that kind of social learning aspect, which I'll talk about more as we go on. But it was useful to think about what some of the trends were that were highlighted right at the beginning of the year, the end of 2022 and at the beginning of 2023. And that really did feed into a lot of our thought, alongside, as I said, the information that we were getting from our own customers too. So let's talk about those problems then, and the things that were going on in the industry that we were seeing and hearing about and experiencing as well. Because I think there are quite a few different things that obviously are priorities for people, that are challenges for people. But one of the things that we always like to do at Thrive is bring it back to the problem that you're having and the problem that you're trying to solve, rather than just jumping on a bandwagon of, oh, let's talk about social learning because everyone's talking about it, so we should as well. So these core areas that we've got on screen are some of the things that we highlighted. So competitive employer landscape, employee experience, burnout, inclusive access, talent mobility, investment in upskilling, and alignment and communications. Now, what I've done here is highlight the things that we're hearing, particularly still now at this point in the year, that are really important to people, and these feed into some of the responses and solutions and questions that we encouraged people to think about at the beginning of the year. But also, I imagine that we're probably going to be looking at them for our 2024 strategy as well, or if we're looking at what that strategy is right now, thinking about how we can enhance employee experience or talent mobility. I think there's a particular focus on talent mobility when it comes to the skills piece, and we'll talk again about that as we go. But these are certainly the core areas that we focused on. And we had a conversation with one of our customers at the beginning of the year, who said that in their exit interviews, they actually found that 40% of all leavers, and that was by far the highest percentage of their leavers, left because of a lack of personal development opportunities. And now that definitely rings true for the HR reports that we see, people leaving their roles as often due to lack of personal development opportunities, or at the same rate as those who do not have the compensation that they're looking for. So that's really interesting, I think, and obviously makes our role within L&D even more important, because we have to really think about what the impact of lack of the correct development opportunities is going to afford people. So at this point, I think it would be really useful to ask, what are the problems that you're seeing in your own organizations, or potentially in the organizations that you work with? Are they the same as the things we've just highlighted? Is talent mobility a core focus for you? What are you concentrating on at the moment? And I think Andrew's just put a chat up on screen that people can feel free to type into, and I can see a couple of people are already typing, but really interested here to hear about what problems you're seeing, and whether there's any similarities or differences to what I just covered at a high level.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, please put your comments in that box. We can see there's some coming through. Joe, the implications of the financial climate. I think that's a common one potentially for many people who are here. Sue's just posted in the other one, NHS, no time to learn. I think time to learn is a potential issue for a few people. What else have we got here? Inclusion and diversity, with a focus on neurodiversity. We're going to talk about some stuff around that, I think, aren't we, Helen?
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
What have we got here? Determining competence gaps, staff turnover and churn. Absolutely, Bob. There's nice to see you, Bob, as well, by the way. Turnover. And I think goes back to the talent pipeline one. You were mentioning talent earlier on. I think talent is a specific issue that people are coming up now. What are your thoughts on what people are putting in here, Helen?
Yeah, there's some things, as you say, Andrew, that we're going to pick up on later on, particularly that kind of inclusivity perspective, neurodiversity, accessibility more broadly. And I'm really pleased to see those being picked out as things that people are focused on and are seeing spoken about a lot, and are challenges within their organizations as well. I'm not pleased at their challenges. I'm pleased that they're being recognized as potentially opportunities for something to happen as a result of it being more of a conversation, which is great. Sue's comment about the NHS bit, there's no time to learn. I was actually having a conversation with someone at an event we ran yesterday who works for an investment bank, and that's their biggest challenge, is people just not having the time. I know it's something we speak about a lot, but it's just that not having the time to learn in a way that they expect to learn as well. So there's an expectation that they're being given content at a certain time, at a certain day, and that's when they sit down to do it, and they are struggling to even find that time. But we're talking about the shift in mindset that occurs to thinking about learning not just as a set time and place, but more of what are you doing in your role, which I think links into this idea of upskilling and what that looks like for an organization, and then ultimately that talent mobility piece as well, because at the end of the day, that's really where what the focus of skills should be, is that well, I'd argue that talent mobility piece for organizations.
Disappointing to see Carol's, the assumption people still need to be attending classroom courses. It's nice that, we're not getting that much more and more now. People seem to moving away from that, recognizing that we can do other things, but it's a shame that still comes up. Innovation, lack of leadership, lack of inclusion, again, mental health, getting our learners to engage with discussion boards.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one, because we're going to speak about community and that kind of building connection again in a moment. But it's one of those things where it's that if we build it, people will use it type approach. That how do you combat that challenge of just because it's there doesn't mean someone's going to use it, and how do you get people actively engaged in those things to then build the communities in a way which we know will benefit their broader learning experience. So I can appreciate that's going to be a challenge for a lot of other people as well. I've just noticed there's one around working in the public sector and the budget challenges that come with that. And I mean, we work with a lot of public sector customers, and that is it rings true across the board for all of them. It's how do they maximize budgets which are already very tight and then being cut at the same time, and how do you kind of make the best of those situations, which it's not just specific to the public sector, but it's much more in focus there. How do you spend the money? There's obviously a lot of scrutiny around that as well.
Yeah Learning by doing, absolutely key. People entering the workforce, that's an interesting point. Sal, the idea of digital literacy, there's a whole piece around that, and different levels of people having digital understanding. We seem to have slowed to a trickle. We won't come back to that question, but if you come back to the recording and you want to have a look at what other people have said, you can come back and you'll be able to see that list. It's interesting comments from everybody, so thank you for that. And we've got 140 people in the room now, so thank you for not all piling in immediately and giving us so much stuff we couldn't read. So thank you. Some really informed responses there. We have an informed audience today, I think.
Absolutely, yeah, really, really insightful. Thank you all for sharing. And I think it's always in these moments quite useful once you do share to realise that other people are experiencing the same challenges. And whilst that's not going to solve your challenges, at least there are people out there that you could bounce ideas off. Or again, that's coming back to the idea of building the community and networking, which again we'll speak about in a moment. But yeah, thank you all for those answers. So really, as I said, what we really wanted to do was cut through the noise of anything that was going off at the beginning of the year that were potentially buzzwords, and avoid jumping on any bandwagons, and respond to some of those problems with practical solutions that people can implement within their organizations, and provide key steps to either get people thinking about these things or continue their thinking on these elements as well. Now, the 5 areas that we've highlighted on screen here were the 5 core things that we pulled out, all quite broad categories, and the application of certain elements within these categories would differ depending on your organization, obviously, and your approach to these things would vary depending on what initiatives or approaches you were taking within your business. But by and large, these 5 areas were the things that we really believed people would be able to drive faster business impact with this year. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. It's having that impact and being able to prove that golden ROI on anything that you're doing, essentially. So we wanted to think of these as, I guess, data patterns rather than trends in response to some of the problems that we'd seen within the industry that we'd highlighted and that we've spoken about before. So I think what's really interesting is, as we said, some of the comments that were just raised in the discussion are particularly around inclusivity and accessibility, and that sort of stuff was something that we were definitely seeing at the beginning of the year as a real key priority for people. And that was not just from a inclusive belonging perspective and DEI perspective within organizations, but from an accessibility of products as well. So from us as a vendor thinking, how do we make our product more accessible to people, and being challenged in that way really positively, which is something I'm quite passionate about as well. So we'll dig into these core areas across the rest of the webinar, and really think about what are some tangible tips or steps that you can take to start thinking about these or continue your thinking on them, and whether they kind of resonate with you. I'd love to continue that conversation, as I said, in the chat as well as we go. But the other thing that we really need to recognize is that at the beginning of the year, I don't think anyone would really have predicted what would happen come March, April time. And, obviously, I'm going to call it out. We missed AI off our list. How dare we? I hear you cry. Looking back now and the impact that AI has had on the conversation, on product development, on people's approach to learning and producing learning, it seems crazy that we weren't able to think about how AI was going to be shaping whatever we do within Thrive or beyond at the beginning of the year. But I think I don't think anyone could necessarily have predicted that. But we'll come back and talk about AI and obviously the future of our what we do in L&D in general, and how it's being impacted by AI. Of course, with the caveat that I am not an AI expert. I, like probably a lot of you on the call, are interested in some of the developments that are happening within the industry at the moment, and from a product perspective, what's happening with other vendor products on the market too. So very exciting time. Obviously something that we're approaching with an element of caution, optimistic caution, I'd say, about how we implement and utilize AI as a platform. But more broadly, it's really interesting to see the impact that AI tools are having on individuals within organizations as well. So feel free to carry on talking about that in the chat as well if you want to. So let's get into the good stuff, I think. So social learning is the fundamental reason that we one of the fundamental reasons we created Thrive. It is the basis of what we do on the platform, the idea that you can lean into the knowledge of the people within your organizations to help shape learning and development for others, but to give access to core information that is not just created in a piece of content that the L&D team put on a platform. So encouraging a space in which people can upload user-generated content or share ideas is brilliant. But beyond that as well, we're thinking about how you establish connections with people, how you collaborate with people, and ultimately how you communicate as a business as well, because a large proportion of our customers particularly use Thrive from that communications and comms perspective, as well as the delivery of learning experiences as well, which is, for certain organizations works really well because you're unifying and comms through an experience and a platform where people are going for different things, but people know and recognize where those messages are coming from. We're seeing, I think, quite a lot this idea of community and how you bring that into your L&D practices. And that was certainly something that actually what I'll call out now actually is that I added the word community into this slide for this session, because what we spoke about at the beginning of the year was connection, communication, collaboration, and the social learning elements that go along with how you do that within your organization. But actually bringing that all together and responding and listening to what is going on in the community, it is all about community and how you build that into your learning experiences and extend that idea of learning as something that only happens as a one-off into something that is more of an experience and something that you share with other people as well. So, I mean, and just to tell you a small story here around building communities to share knowledge, I set up my own community at the end of 2022, but really kicked it off at the beginning of 2023, called Women In, which creates a space to bring women in learning and development, L&D, HR, and associated areas together to provide that safe space for people and to create those connections, that ability to communicate, to share knowledge and ideas and look for advice. And what we're seeing there is that kind of external community develop that guides internal practices, individual practices, and extends thinking in a way that is quite tricky to do for a lot of L&D teams, because you end up working quite siloed, and you need to find out, what does best practice look like? And that's where you're really leaning into community helps from an L&D professional angle. And then if we're thinking about that for ourselves, how do we then create that experience for our end users as well? And it's really important as well. From that, obviously, from that social learning. We're social animals. We learn from each other. We pick up habits and best practices in that way. So, yeah, really, really important. But I suppose, where can you start if you're thinking about this? And I think one thing to think about is what tools you have in your tech stack that can be used together. So does your learning platform integrate with any of your comms tools or HR systems? What does that user experience look like? Can you integrate with Teams, for example, and share information in that way in a Teams channel? And quite potentially quite basic things to start thinking about. But ultimately, if you're working in silo within organizations, which often happens, you don't necessarily know all the subscriptions that certain departments have that you could leverage and work with or work together on. So I think that's a really great place to start, is taking a look at what you have available. And a lot of the time, particularly for larger organizations, what happens as a result of doing that is you realize how many things you have and that potentially you don't need, because a lot of the time you don't have the time to take the step back and think about, do we really need this for our business? So that's, I think, one thing to think of. I'm just conscious there's probably a question here around communities of practice have grown organically already in our org, but they are slower paced, medium learning, hard to keep motivation and engagement with people. Do you have any advice on this? Yeah, and I think that is a struggle. I think, as I spoke about previously, of setting up the communities, and there's always that kind of buzz around something new and something exciting. But actually, once that newness and excitement has worn off, people either kind of move on or forget that they're there. And that's when it becomes, I think, really important to think with a marketer's mindset, and that kind of campaign approach to bringing people back to the communities. And I think that there's probably a couple of ways in which you can think about this, and you might already be doing it, but having some kind of champions that drive conversation. So coming up with key topics and asking questions or asking for advice on certain things, I think is a really good way to kind of keep the conversation going. A couple of our customers, it's not from that community perspective, but from a broader platform perspective, have identified learning champions that they can really leverage to lead and lead by example, but also instigate kind of content uploads or product knowledge sharing on a platform. And I think that's quite similar for communities within businesses as well, like the ones that you described there, Katie. So maybe something to think about, but thinking with that, like, how would you market this? How do you continue to market it? It's not a one-off thing. Keep it kind of flowing, and have some champions there as well. And hopefully that's useful for you.
I was just going to add to that, Helen. There's some interesting comments. Both Joe Cook and I were thinking of exactly the same person, who's a guy called Richard Millington, who is incredibly generous in his sharing. You can connect with him through LinkedIn, which Joe's identified, and I've also put a link through to. He does a whole community strategy guide about the idea that, if you build these places, people will come, Field of Dreams, and it doesn't work like that. And you need to work on communities to try and make these things work. So really, really useful advice that you'll find in there as well. And thank you, Joe, for highlighting that as well.
Thank you, Joe.
I agree with you. Community, it's one of those things people go, oh yeah, just build a community, and it doesn't work like that.
And I think the key thing there is there needs to be a need in the first place. So it needs to be responding to something that you've observed or you've seen, and you think actually creating this space for people to discuss something is going to be a good solution for that. Because I think if you're just creating a group for the sake of creating a group, that is why a lot of things fizzle out, is because there wasn't really a need there in the first place. So if you could hone in on that, do your research beforehand, you'll probably be more likely to be successful as well. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip to the next one, which leans into the third block on screen. There is how do you encourage connection, communication, and social interaction within your own L&D initiative? So again, a new chat box will come up on screen that you can all add to, or as people have been doing using the other one as well. But if you can use the main chat box, that'd be great. So how do you do this within your own organizations? What kind of tools do you use? What approaches do you take? Really keen to hear how you're doing this, or rather, are you thinking about doing this and not really sure where to start?
Thank you, Helen. And like last time, stick your answers in the box on the left. Otherwise, I just end up copying and pasting for the rest of the morning. Yeah, really interesting. This communication and connection. There's the worst is the half-life, which is where you start off and you have 200 people, and then it halves to 100, and then it halves to 50, and then it halves to 25, and then it comes to 12, and then 6, and 3, and then eventually it's one person on their own just answering the questions on their own. So, yeah. So let's have a look. Well, we've got Helen Bailey asking people to complete tasks in teams and present back virtually or face-to-face. I like that idea. That's a nice idea. Yeah. We build an integrated part of Kelly is the learning program, encouraging it to lead from learners utilizing the learning and application of learning. Again, that's nice. Emily uses a Slack channel for learning and sharing an interview once a month. Imran's got let's just put in the other chat about running a learning skills development session. I'll just move that one over for you.
So it's interesting that it sounds like there's quite a few things that are bringing people together almost like in almost like a lunch and learn way to share knowledge. It'd be interesting to know kind of whether there's opportunities for that conversation to continue elsewhere once, that's space has disappeared essentially, or if they do happen or if they don't, and whether you'd want to encourage that or not. And I'm not necessarily expecting answers to these questions, it's just thought provoking.
I'm interested in Lisa, because the Lisa Gray, I think, is use communication campaigns via Yammer, which I think is interesting. So not using learning platforms, but using other platforms outside. What are your thoughts on that, Helen?
Well, I think it's it's really useful to be able to, again, to utilize whatever tools that you've got available to deliver content in a way that, and I think this, sorry, that to digress, it goes back to what I was speaking around, the fact that you don't necessarily have to have a defined space for learning to happen in, and it's that kind of breaking the idea of what learning is for you as an individual. I guess it's that old age, I'm going to sit down and do an hour's course, and that's what learning is for my organization. So I think using things like Yammer that are, I guess, not the expected tool is probably a good way to do that. But it would also, I imagine, feed more smoothly into your everyday experience within a business. So yeah, I can definitely see the benefit of doing that, in the same way that I think pulling content from a learning platform, obviously like Thrive, into a Teams channel and delivering content in that way is probably quite a similar approach.
Again, I agree 100%. I think you're spot on there, and we're seeing it again. We're seeing who did I see? Graham's talking about using Teams, Facebook, and comm systems. We've got Stephen Power talking about a range of social inclusion development networks and different tools, team, internet, webinars, videos. Again, the man with the podcast voice is what interested. There doesn't seem to be much audio stuff going there. But yeah, coffee clubs for people to get together. Simon, a matrix suite of content to develop our people from new L&D professionals all the way through to instructional design roles. So it's interesting that there's lots of L&D led initiatives here. I'd be interested to find out which are the things that are communities which then start working on their own, or is there constant L&D input required to make these things work? What are your thoughts on that, Helen?
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to see what's happening across an organization that would be classed as learning, but isn't run by the L&D team as well. So,
Yeah.
those kind of sessions probably are happening or could be happening elsewhere. And I think that's really when that idea of community and extended learning happens, is when you empower people that aren't in the L&D team to take the initiative to do those things. I mean, that's the dream, isn't it? So yeah, that definitely something that I would see as a real success if they start to happen organically, if there's kind of people that set their own up, and that's again, coming back to women in, that's happening organically within that group, is that people are kind of sparking off and going over here and doing their own thing. And ultimately that's what you want from a community, is to feed the ideas and give people the space and the confidence to go and do that for themselves as well. And I think organizations that can empower people to do that are really setting themselves up for success.
And interesting. So anyone can create content, which I love that idea, Simon, the user generated stuff. But I think the Susan, I think, is absolutely nailed it, which is the Yamaran teams, although we're not consistently good at it. And I think I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's about regular and often, and making sure these things are consistent.
Yeah, and I think that's again, that comes back to the time challenge. That's not just your end users having the time challenge; it's you as an L&D team having the time to commit to doing those things in the first place, and making sure you're consistent at it, which is a challenge. Andrew, I am conscious of time. Are you okay if I move on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I
Good
just love getting involved in the conversation with people, because we've always got smart people in these rooms.
Yeah, I mean, we could carry on talking about this for a long time, I think.
I know.
So yeah, I appreciate, again, everyone contributing to that conversation. So thank you. So we'll go on to speak around data. And again, it would be interesting to hear what you're doing in terms of data collection and gathering, and where that data is coming from for you as an L&D team, because it's not, well, often not the L&D team that have access to the data in the first place. It's your IT team or your HR teams or other teams within the business. So was that a new thing for you as an L&D professional to start looking elsewhere for data? Because I appreciate there are a lot of people that are only on the beginning of this journey. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that. But ultimately, data comes down to the fact that you'll be future-proofing your learning by leveraging data in order to showcase how effective something has been or how successful something has been. And it's ultimately there to demonstrate impact and to measure change. Really, it's not necessarily just information that is good to collate. You can actually show real impact and measurement and that kind of change through how you tell data stories. Essentially, I think external data points here are crucial, and really honing in on what outcomes you're looking for, and they really need to align to what your organizational objectives are. And then you can start to kind of look at how you can start to tell the right story and to collect the right data once you're honing in on what those goals are and what you're trying to achieve with your learning and development initiatives. And I think, I suppose, external data points are crucial here to relating your efforts to those changes or outcomes. And we're definitely seeing a lot more time being spent with stakeholders, really understanding what measures they use to quantify the area in question. So here we're really thinking about how you as an L&D team are working with other teams to figure out what you're trying to solve with the initiatives that you're developing for them, or creating for them, or facilitating for them. But what would be the measure of success for them, and how do you then start benchmarking that information? I think having that benchmark data, that initial look at this is where we are, and sometimes that doesn't exist, and then it's hard to think about what the goal ultimately is going to be. But really, you just need to start somewhere. But often there will be information that you can utilize, and if there's not information you can utilize, that's when you start saying, well, actually, we really need to start tracking these things. So the key thing here really is identifying the need, and being able to network effectively across an organization, and really, I suppose, planning your impact in terms of which teams need prioritizing which teams you're going to support and how you're going to do that. And not just going after everyone and being kind of the team that supports everyone as much as possible. You've got to be quite strategic about who you can support and when and why you're doing that. And then once you're thinking about starting to measure something, or when you're going to start trying to show the return on investment of whatever it is that you're gathering, you really need to start thinking about how you're going to roll that out. And don't do it at a time when everyone is going to be on holiday, or if you're a sales team and Q4 is going to be really busy for you, don't roll out an initiative that starts gathering data unless it's about how busy they are at that time of year, because you're not going to get the buy-in from stakeholders because they're not going to have the time. So really think about who it is that you need to leverage data from and when their busy times are, and how you can work with people in that regard. And so I've highlighted here, prioritize, network, and measure. So that comes back to what I was just saying in terms of prioritizing what your core focus areas are, network to find out who it is that you need to be speaking to in order to access and leverage that data, and then start measuring it, and then set some goals around that as well. And I appreciate that's quite a broad or high level approach to that data journey. But I think if you're at the beginning of it, this is quite useful to think about, and is certainly something we were thinking about at the beginning of the year for a lot of our customers. We're experiencing this focus on, well, actually, we need to be telling the right stories. We need the data to back it up, which is so positive. And we're becoming much more data literate as L&D professionals than we ever have been before, which can only be a positive in my eyes. Although that opens up a new skills gap, I think, around data analysis that a lot of L&D professionals don't have. So there's a conversation there around how do we upskill as L&D professionals. But yeah, really interesting shift that I think is continuing to spread across the year. It's not something that's dropped off. It's still something that's really important, and it's even more important now than it was at the beginning of the year, arguably. And we're telling a lot of really good stories from our customers about where they've started, and either running experiments to show how effective a learning program has been in terms of sales, ultimately at the end of the day, for one of our customers, or being able to gather data that goes a lot deeper than those vanity metrics that you see touted around a lot in terms of engagement and completions, because ultimately, what does that mean at the end of the day? And I think that's one thing that, when you're working with a learning platform provider, you really need to be honing in on what your success metrics look like from the beginning, short term and long term. So I'd say if you're working with a provider and you've not done that yet, start doing it now, is my advice. And so this brings me to inclusivity as the next core focus area that we chose at the beginning of the year. And what's really reassuring to me is that when I was revisiting these slides, I actually felt like inclusivity wasn't as big a priority as it had been at the beginning of the year for a lot of individuals. But really pleased to see in the chat that it is something that your organizations are focused on, particularly from that neurodiversity angle. And I think that certainly rings true with a lot of conversations over the past couple of months, particularly in Women In. Again, in the communities that I operate in, that does ring true. But the broader focus on DE&I initiatives, and maybe this is an observation that we were talking around DE&I quite broadly for the past couple of years, and now we're getting more specific and being able to hone in on certain core areas like I just hit my mic, like neurodiversity or accessibility, and that's obviously a real positive. So yeah, I'd be curious to know whether I think Andrew, we've got a poll around this to see whether accessibility, inclusivity is still important to you or not as important anymore. So what was the question? Is inclusivity higher or lower on your agenda than it was at the beginning of 2023?
And we've got 126 people in the room, and we've already got nearly 30 answers, so people are very, very quick on the go on this one. We haven't quite ended the poll, but please choose from the 5 options. So is inclusivity higher or lower than it was at the beginning of 2023? And the options are much higher, a little lower, much lower, or it's never been on the agenda. And we're up to some 40 or so responses, so I'll give it another few seconds. Let's put the results out there so that people can see how other people are voting.
Well, I mean, based on what we've got so far, it's really positive to me to see that it's either a little bit higher or much higher than it was at the beginning of the year, which is can only be a positive thing in my eyes, that we're thinking about how we create more inclusive practices across R&D for our people. And that will look, obviously, inclusion covers so many different areas, and there's the idea of focusing on belonging now alongside that. But ultimately, are we creating equitable learning experiences across our business?
Yeah.
But how can we revisit and rethink some of the things we're already doing? Because there's what we call internally at Thrive an accessibility debt. A lot of the time in content or programs that have already been created, or products that have already been created, that where accessibility wasn't at the forefront and inclusivity wasn't at the forefront of our minds or someone's mind when they were being created. And so you've got to go back and revisit and think, actually, we could do this better, and how we're going to be better moving forward as well.
I love that. So that's 78% of the audience who voted, and yeah, we've had over half the audience here vote. I mean, it's nearly 2/3 of the audience here voted. So, you know, 3/4 are saying, yeah, that inclusivity is higher, which I think mirrors your point exactly. And interestingly, it's not been on the agenda for 10% of the people here. So, yeah,
Yeah, so
really
so
interesting.
whether that's a point of thought for people to think about, maybe we need to start thinking about this, or how do we get people interested in this? Because it might be that it's not a concern for the organization more broadly, which again feels quite worrying to me. But that might be why that it's not been on the agenda, is because there's not that organizational interest in it, which is obviously a huge challenge in an L&D team, to not have the space to focus on things like that all the time, probably.
And Joe Cook has highlighted as well. Thank you, Joe. Perhaps it's not on their agenda. It could be to do with their job role. So maybe not negative per se. It's just not within their you know, their gift to actually be able to do anything about it. So
Yeah,
thank you, Joe.
absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Joe. Lovely. So we'll thank you everyone for voting and for taking part in that. And like we said, really positive to see where the results were that were coming through there. And again, conscious that we're heading towards the end of this session, and we've got a few other areas to cover off here. And there's skills is the next thing that we focused on as something that if you're focusing on as an organization, you're going to be able to tackle some of those problems that we highlighted at the beginning. Specifically, I'm going to hone in on talent mobility there, because ultimately, again, as we said, our opinion is that if you're kind of focused on your skills agenda for an organization, you should be enabling talent mobility more easily, and ultimately attracting and retaining talent more as well. That goes back to the stat that I mentioned, around 40% of leavers were leaving because of lack of personal development opportunities, and that could tie into skills development quite neatly. So here, I think what would be good is to think around what is business critical for you as an organization when it comes to skills. So what skills do your business and your people need in order to do their jobs effectively? And then make the space for personal development, which sounds so easy to do when I say it like that. But I know it's really important to think not only from a skills development from that broader organizational overview, but actually, what do your individual employees need as well, and are they gaining the opportunities and spaces to upskill themselves as individuals in a way that they want to, alongside how you need them to at the same time. But skills the skills conversation has been going on for years, and it's not going away, because I don't think anyone's really nailed this yet. And you know, it's interesting to think around why that is, and what how can we create, I'm saying how we as vendors respond to what people need from skills development perspective on a platform, for example. But then what do learning and development professionals need in order to understand what skills they want to develop, and allow the space for that flexibility of skills development too, which is where I think that agile mindset comes into what skills look like for an organization, as it doesn't have to be a very rigid framework that, I mean, yes, there's a time and place for that, and it is useful, but what you're cutting out by honing in specifically on skills that individuals need for particular roles is the opportunity for individuals to say, actually, I've been learning about this over here, and I think it's a great skill, and I can actually see myself moving in a different direction as a result of access to individuals or learning experiences that I might not necessarily have had the time to access previously. I guess what can you do now? And that kind of comes back to what I was just saying in terms of how are you identifying and communicating what those operational, values-based, and individual skills are. So that again comes back to this idea that the business will have ideas around what are operational skills, what are the skills you need to be able to do your jobs, what are the skills you're missing from the talent that you've got within your organization, and then values-based skills being those that tie into the values of your organization and the mission of your organization more broadly, and then individual skills being that element of personalized approach to I know I want to learn this, or I need the space to learn this, which again is something that a lot of the time is I feel is missing from people's approach to skills, that it does become from that more there is more of a focus just on what the business needs rather than as an individual, and thinking about the ability and the talent that would bring into um, uh, different roles within a business, for example. So that's where asking your people, I think, is really important. So are they developing the right skills? What skills are they missing for their jobs? How are you then feeding that into your initiatives, and providing the opportunities for people to upskill on the things that are relevant to them? And I think there's really something in here around terminology across your organization as well. So we noticed this within our own platform, that people were uploading what we call skills tags for upskilling on certain topic areas. And they were utilizing multiple different names for the same thing ultimately. So someone would upload some content in one area calling it communication skills, and someone would call it communicating efficiently, or they'd end up with multiple different skills which ultimately had the same thing. So how are you communicating that across your business as this is a particular skill that I'm like data analysis, for example, that I'm focused on? That's the term that we're going to use as a business. And we created a feature on the platform which allows people to merge those tags essentially, so you can accumulate that terminology more effectively, because that is something that I don't think you will ever get away from unless you have really rigorous control of how teams access that skills information. But it's something to be aware of when you're communicating with others, is they might have a different way of talking about the same skill. So yeah, just something to be conscious of there. And then ultimately, as I said, that leads into connecting your skills strategy with talent mobility and hiring. So there's a real opportunity here to think about what your current attrition rates are, and how you can track those, how many people are moving into new roles, and how many people are doing that as a direct result of the opportunities that you're creating and the skills that are developing through your L&D initiatives. And it sounds, again, I'm making it sound very simple, and I know that it's not, but ultimately that's what it will come down to as well. So I think lastly, I really wanted to focus in on coaching, and we've got some really positive stories to tell around coaching, but I think I'm definitely seeing it become more and more popular across L&D teams. There was a conversation at the beginning of the year, I think, about how important coaching was and is, and not just necessarily at the beginning of the year, but it has been for a long time. But more teams seem to be investing time in creating coaching and mentoring schemes within their businesses, a lot of the time in a very manual, laborious way. So I feel like there's quite an opportunity here somewhere for that to be kind of taken off people's hands and made less manual. But it's really important to see that people are leaning into the power of coaching, both from a kind of peer-to-peer coaching point of view, but also utilizing either external or internal coaches for your business, because it really does lead into that self-development much more easily, I think, particularly from a one-to-one point of view. But also there's that high performance element as well. I know high performance is a contentious term, but it's how can you then start to get the best out of your people in order to meet targets or generate revenue, for example. The thing with coaching for me is how do you make it equitable across an organization? Because traditionally, individual coaches are quite expensive, and that just isn't within the realms of L&D budget. So that is when internal coaching becomes so important, thinking about those schemes that you can set up, identifying coaches across your business, potentially upskilling individuals initially. So there's that upfront investment, but then spreading that knowledge to managers, for example, across your organization, and they become this coaching the coach essentially, and they spread that kind of knowledge and allow people to experience coaching in a much more equitable way. But there is a cost sometimes associated with it. So I think, and I'll speak about AI again in a minute, but I feel like there's a real opportunity here for AI to really help support organizations with their coaching approaches. But it's certainly something that we've hired an internal sales coach at Thrive and an internal coach for anyone within the business, so people have access to coaching consistently. And we've got some real positive stories to tell about the impact that they've had on the organization, and particularly from our sales perspective, enabling people to their self-awareness, their ability to research, to respond, to listen, and therefore have the right conversations and identify the right problems with our customers. So it's been a huge shift for us and a different approach for us as an organization. Really positive to see that internal investment within the vendor space as well. So it's great to have that available. But if you don't have that access to an individual, you can, as I said, identify your current coaches or people who have coaching skills and how they're doing that, and how there are simple measures, simple approaches that you can take to introduce coaching, I think, across teams within the business. So utilizing, again, that kind of going back to that social sharing, that knowledge sharing, user generated content about what coaching looks like for you as a business, and or what it looks like in general. I'm thinking about what impacts introducing coaching would bring, because I think there are some really tangible benchmarks that you can work with here, leaning back into that data point that I was just talking about. And then what type of coaching, I guess, will have most impact in your organization? Is it one-to-one coaching? Is it group sessions? There are different options. And I think thinking about what's going to be right for you is really important, and ultimately what's right for your people. So that brings me on to AI, and I think what I wanted to say here is that AI is that shiny thing that everyone's talking about, that it's a tool in your toolkit. Well, ChatGPT, for example, is a tool in your toolkit. But how will products start to utilize AI, or continue to utilize and enhance the way that they use AI to, I guess, solve some of these problems? And that's the key thing. Again, I'll bring it back to is identifying what problems exist within an organization, and then looking at the solutions that you already have in place, and whether they utilize AI, or whether you can bring AI into whatever it is that you do. And I think there's that kind of, again, to say, optimistic caution around how, particularly kind of from a vendor product perspective, how people were, I suppose, jumping on the bandwagon of, we're going to get AI in here, we're going to do AI, we're going to use AI for this, but actually thinking quite calmly and strategically around what problems and what elements of the platform can be leveraged through AI to create and solve, not create, to solve problems for individuals. I think that's ultimately what I'd ask people to hone in on here is, what are you trying to solve by using AI? And is AI actually really something that you're going to be looking at to use here to solve a particular problem? Is it going to be worthwhile? Or is it just a shiny new thing that you think you need when actually you might not? So just some things to think about. But when we're thinking about coaching, I can really see the benefit that the AI will bring to making coaching more equitable, gathering skills data. That, like, the opportunity there is, I think, quite high, and gathering data in general. I think that side of AI is really exciting. So almost bang on time. I think we've got a couple of minutes left. So Andrew, I don't know whether there are any more questions, but just to say, at the beginning of the year, we created this PDF of all of these wonderful questions that we asked, which are still, it appears, quite relevant and important as we head into the end of the year and into 2024. So please feel free to download this via the QR code, or I think you can click the link on the screen as well. And yeah, feedback and let me know your thoughts, and if we've got time for probably half a question with 1 minute to go.
I don't even think we've got time for half a question, unfortunately.
No.
Thank you, Helen. We could have done 5 separate sessions on those 5 things that you identified, and then a 6th one on AI as well, to be honest. So
We could.
luckily the AI one was done this morning. So as I've said in the chat, please do go to where the recordings for the webinars are, and you'll see the one for this morning. But you will also find this one when it goes live as well. So massive thank you, Helen. That was really, really good. I'm just going to paste a couple of links in here for people. So there were some really interesting things identified in the chat. So let me just find these, and I'll paste these into the chat. Here we go.
And thank you everyone for contributing so much, because obviously that interaction makes the session. So really appreciate all your insight and input there as well. And looking forward to kind of going back and looking at some of those comments and maybe providing some insights on those to the broader community.
Absolutely. So we've added the links there. We've added Kelly's, we've added Joe's, the link to Fever Bee. There's also the link there if people would like to click on that as well. Oh, wonder why that's. I see, because I pressed the enter key there. We've got links to Helen's LinkedIn profile, my LinkedIn profile, and also Don, who's in the background doing other things at the moment. The LSG webinars, so the recording on that link there, and also there's a link through to Helen's podcast, which is highly recommended. It's a very good listen. It's Helen's podcast. Massive thank you again, Helen. Thank you to everybody for the room. Like I say all the time, these rooms and these sessions are only as good as the people who are in the room. I mean, not that Helen's brilliant anyway, but having the conversation I think really does help. So a massive thank you to everybody for your time and contributions this morning. We have 2 further webinars in 2 weeks' time. And interestingly enough, as the things we've been talking about, the first one is how to combine AI in your workforce to drive productivity and performance. And the second one that we'll be running on that day, so that's 2 weeks on Thursday, today rather I should say, is leveraging the power of AI and software adoption to drive your learning and development success. So again, it's the hot topic. It's the thing that everybody wants to be talking about. So massive